Emily had always preferred working the night shift. Fewer patients, less chaos, and a certain eerie quiet that, despite the occasional unsettling moment, gave her peace. St. Mary's General Hospital had been her workplace for just over a year, and while she had heard her fair share of ghost stories from senior nurses, she never paid much attention to them. Hospitals were places of life and death. Of course, people imagined things. It was a bitterly cold December night when she first saw her. It was just past 2:30 a.m., and Emily was making her usual rounds. The dim corridors were illuminated by the soft hum of fluorescent lights, the occasional flicker of a bulb reminding her of just how old this building was. She pulled her cardigan tighter around her shoulders as she pushed her cart past the rooms, pausing at each door to check vitals and ensure the patients were comfortable. The night had been uneventful, save for a few groggy requests for painkillers or water. Then she heard it. A slow, rhythmic creak against the floor. A soft shuffle, deliberate yet unhurried. At first, she thought it was one of the janitors mopping the hallway, but as she turned her head, she saw a frail, elderly woman standing near room 307. The woman was clad in an old, faded hospital gown, its fabric looking almost yellowed with time. Her thin hands gripped a rusted walker, her back hunched as she stared down the hall. Emily's first instinct was concern. Patients weren't supposed to be wandering around at night, especially not alone. "Ma'am, are you all right? Do you need help?" Emily's voice was soft, careful not to startle her. The woman turned her head slowly, her pale, watery eyes meeting Emily's. There was something unsettling in the way she looked at her, like she was seeing through her rather than at her. "I need to find Henry." Emily frowned. She had gone through the patient list earlier. There was no Henry admitted to their floor. "Do you know which room Henry is in? Maybe I can help you find him." The woman's grip on her walker tightened, her bony fingers whitening from the pressure. Emily noticed her lips trembling, as if she was struggling to speak. She took a cautious step closer. Just as she opened her mouth to reassure the woman, a gust of cold air swept through the hallway. The temperature dropped so suddenly that Emily's breath misted in front of her. And in the blink of an eye, the woman was gone. Emily's heart slammed against her ribs. She turned in a frantic circle, looking down the hall, peering into nearby rooms, but there was no sign of the woman. It was as if she had never been there. A deep, creeping unease settled in her stomach as she hurried back to the nurse's station, her hands still shaking. She described the woman to Karen, one of the senior nurses, who had been working at St. Mary's for over 15 years. The moment Emily mentioned the walker, Karen's face drained of color. She put her coffee down with a trembling hand and exchanged a glance with another nurse, Daniel, before speaking. "That sounds like Mrs. Wilkins." Emily had never heard the name before. She asked who she was, and Karen let out a shaky breath before explaining. "Mrs. Wilkins was a patient here decades ago. She had been admitted for heart problems and was expected to recover, but she constantly asked about her husband, Henry. No one ever came to visit her. Nurses at the time tried to console her, telling her Henry was probably at home resting, but Mrs. Wilkins refused to believe it. She insisted something was wrong. One night she tried to leave her bed to search for him herself. She made it as far as the hallway before collapsing. When the nurses found her, she kept whispering, "I need to find Henry," over and over. She passed away that same night. Emily swallowed hard. The details were too precise, too eerily similar to what she had just experienced. But before she could process it, Daniel cleared his throat, looking even more disturbed. "There's something else. Henry was dead before she was even admitted here." Emily stared at him in horror. Karen nodded solemnly. Henry had died in a car accident 2 days before Mrs. Wilkins was brought in. She never knew. She died thinking he was still alive, waiting for her. The air in the nurse's station felt heavier, the hum of the overhead lights suddenly too loud. Emily felt a chill run down her spine as she realized what this meant. Mrs. Wilkins was still looking for him. That was the first night she saw her, but it wouldn't be the last. Over the following weeks, Emily began noticing small things. Room 307, which had remained empty for months, would sometimes have its lights flicker at odd hours. The air around the doorway always seemed colder than the rest of the hospital. Some nights as she walked the halls, she swore she heard the soft shuffle of a walker behind her, but when she turned, there was never anyone there. Then came the second sighting. It was another late shift, and Emily was restocking supplies when she caught movement in her peripheral vision. She turned just in time to see the same elderly woman standing at the far end of the hall. This time, Mrs. Wilkins was facing away from her, staring at the entrance of room 307. Emily felt frozen in place. She didn't know what compelled her to do it, but she called out to her. "Mrs. Wilkins?" The woman turned, and Emily's breath caught in her throat. Her eyes were hollow, dark voids where her pupils should have been. Her lips moved, but no sound came out at first. Then, in a rasping whisper that sent ice through Emily's veins, she spoke. "He never came." Then, just as before, she vanished. Emily didn't tell anyone about that encounter. She didn't need to. Other nurses began sharing their own experiences, lights turning on by themselves in room 307, the distant creak of a walker in an empty hallway. One janitor even claimed he saw a woman in a hospital gown reflected in the glass doors of the supply room, but when he turned, no one was there. One night, determined to understand more, Emily went through old hospital records. She found Mrs. Wilkins' file. She had indeed been a patient there in the early 90s. Her death report was simple. Cardiac arrest. Passed away at 2:43 a.m. Emily's blood ran cold. That was the exact time she had seen her that first night. The final encounter came weeks later. Emily was finishing her rounds when she heard it again, the unmistakable shuffle of a walker. This time, instead of fear, she felt something else. Sadness. She turned to find Mrs. Wilkins standing there, her eyes softer this time. Emily took a deep breath and spoke in the gentlest voice she could muster. "Henry's not coming, Mrs. Wilkins. He's waiting for you." For the first time, the old woman's expression changed. A look of realization, of deep sorrow, then something else. Peace. Her lips parted slightly, as if she wanted to say something, but instead she simply nodded. And then she was gone. After that night, the sighting stopped. Room 307 no longer felt cold. The eerie noises faded. It was as if Mrs. Wilkins had finally moved on. But sometimes when Emily walked those halls alone, she still thought she heard the faint echo of a walker, just for a moment, as if someone was saying thank you.